Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Tiffany Harlick, and we have been doing a super fun October special. And so I wanted to bring in a special guest, Enocha, from the Bonaventure Historical Society. And so this is a little outside of our normal topic, and I'm really just excited to learn, get some stories, get some history. The Bonaventure Historical Society is in Savannah, Georgia. And Enocha, thank you so much for being here to share on behalf of the society. I would love for you just to tell people a little bit about it as an introduction.
Sure. Thank
Yeah.
you for having me.
Yeah.
Uh, so, Bonaventure Cemetery today has gone through a lot of different changes. It actually started off as a plantation during the early history of the city. The city itself was founded in 1733. The plantation was founded not too terribly long after that. Went through a lot of different changes, and then finally in the early 1800s, it was sold. A man named Peter Wiltberger decided to buy that property in the 1840s and turn it into a cemetery. Originally, it was called Evergreen. Went through a few different changes. Eventually, in the early 1900s, it ends up with the city, and it is renamed Bonaventure Cemetery.
Okay, perfect. So I want to also just give everybody an idea of how vast it is. So
Oh yeah,
how big is the cemetery?
it's 100+ acres.
10+
Uh,
acres.
I get people all the time who stop by the visitor center on the weekends and ask if they can walk it. And I'm like, yeah, you can, but you're not going to see it all today.
Right. And so how many people are, how do I ask this appropriately? How many are buried there?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't know the answer
Yeah.
to that. Since we're the Historical Society, we really only keep up with the historic graves there. But it's still an active cemetery. People are still being buried there.
Mm.
Uh, there are multiple funerals a week, and it's kind of bragging rights in Savannah to say that you are going to be buried out at Bonaventure Cemetery.
Okay. Okay. So tell us a little bit about why that is, some of your historical figures that really stand out.
Right. So the cemetery itself was designed as a Victorian garden cemetery.
Mhm.
Around that time, you started seeing people around the country and also in the UK rethinking burials and not just thinking of them as, oh, this person died, we buried them, and that's it. They were actually going out and hanging out in the cemeteries, which sounds really morbid today. But that's what they did. It was a destination. There was a trolley stop that brought people out there.
Mhm.
There are portraits of people riding their horses from town out to Bonaventure to hang out and explore the cemetery because it was a garden on top of being a burial ground.
Mhm.
And part of the original owner, Peter Wiltberger's plan to get everyone to want to be buried out there was to get some of the early colonists reinterred from their original burial grounds. A lot of them had been buried in the city in Colonial Park Cemetery, moving them over to Bonaventure.
Oh
One
my.
of them, yeah. There's a joke in Savannah that's kind of true that you move around more after death than you do in life. And it's because of this. So one of the people he got reinterred out there was a man named Noble Jones.
Mhm.
Noble was on the first boat of colonists to come over from England with General Oglethorpe, the founder of the colony of Savannah.
Mhm.
And when he died, he was buried out on his plantation, Wormslow, which is now a state historic site. But then his family decided to rebury him in Colonial Park Cemetery. Then that closed, and Peter's like, "Hey, I can move him out to Bonaventure. Sounds pretty cool, right?" So they said, "Yeah, sure. We've already buried him twice. What's a third time?" So he's been reinterred out at Bonaventure. He's been out there for a while though, so we think he's going to stick around.
Okay. Okay.
Uh, but Noble was one in a list of early colonists who were reinterred out there. And then once things started to catch on, other really important families in Savannah decided, oh, well, everyone else is moving out here. We should move grandma and grandpa out here as well. One family that moved out there was the Telfair family. The Telfairs were a very influential family, not just in Savannah, but in Georgia. One of them had been an early governor of the state. And two of their daughters decided to move the family out to Bonaventure. And there's a very famous portrait of one of them, Mary Telfair, riding her horse around the cemetery. But once they made that move, that's when a lot of other people were like, oh, the Telfairs are moving out here. Like, maybe we should be buried out here too. Seems like a good idea. So it kind of took off from there. And now it is famous, not just for having notable Savannahans, but because of a book called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Are you familiar with that book?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So for your listeners who may not be familiar with it,
Yes.
Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil is a mostly nonfiction book about Savannah in the early to mid 1980s. It follows this author, John Barrett, who passed through Savannah kind of on a whim, fell in love with the city, and decided to stay here and sort of document some of the interesting characters who were calling Savannah home then, including a man named Jim Williams, who ended up being arrested and going on trial for killing his boyfriend. Now, in the book and the movie, there is a root worker who goes out to Bonaventure and does some magic to try and make it to where Jim Williams will be found not guilty. The interesting thing is, Danny Hansford, the boyfriend of Jim Williams, is not buried at Bonaventure. He's buried at Greenwich Cemetery, which is next door.
Good.
But that kind of put Bonaventure on the map, and it didn't help that the cover for the novel shows a statue called the Bird Girl, which had been out on a burial plot there. The family did not expect their simple little funerary statuary to be so famous, and so that ended up attracting a lot of tourists. They decided that was not the vibe, so they donated that statue to the Mary Telfair Academy in town.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but part of the movie Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil was filmed out there. Several other films have been filmed out there, as well as some TV shows. So it's a very well-known cemetery in Savannah.
Yeah, in the South, I would say,
Oh yeah.
It's kind of a weird thing I do. Like whenever I travel, I have not been there. I would love to go there. It's one of the reasons I contacted you guys is because it's like on my cemetery bucket list, which sounds so weird. But when I go to a new city, I love to sit in the cemetery. I love to find a yoga studio. I love to find a way to give back, and I like to sit in the cemetery. And I think it's just a peaceful way to respect and honor the city, the history, the people that came before. And so tell me a little bit about how the cemetery interacts with the historical society. What is that like? Like, how is your setup?
So the city cemeteries department owns, is it 5 or 6 cemeteries now? I think they just purchased one, so it might be 6.
Okay.
So they own several cemeteries in town. We are the Bonaventure Historical Society, so we are not in charge of burial records or any of that stuff. We are just there to preserve the history. And a couple of ways that we do that is we raise funds for historic preservation, some of the monuments out there. One of the gates to the cemetery, unfortunately, was hit by a person in a car recently, completely destroyed them. So we're actually in the process of raising money to restore those.
Okay.
We have been raising money to restore Little Gracie's statue. Little Gracie is another really famous grave out there. She's probably the most visited grave out of Bonaventure.
Yeah.
She was a little girl who passed away in 1889, just a few months before she would have turned 7. And it's interesting that she's one of the most visited graves because it's not like she was terribly famous during her life. Like, people knew her in town, but it's not like she was an actress or, a wealthy woman. She was just a kid who lived at a hotel. Her parents managed the Pulaski House Hotel, which used to stand off of Johnson Square. There's a Regions Bank there today. But unfortunately, in 1889, she contracted a really bad case of pneumonia and passed away. And her parents were absolutely devastated. She was their only child. They never had any others. But they paid for this burial plot out in Bonaventure and buried her there. They also contacted a local artist named John Walsh to construct a headstone based off of a photograph of her that was taken shortly before her death. And this is a very lifelike headstone. I'm sure since you enjoy hanging out
Yeah.
in cemeteries, you've seen some gorgeous funerary statues. Uh, and the amount of artistry and technique, and oh goodness, like some of these artists were so talented, and you just don't think about them being artists, especially if they concentrated on headstones.
Right.
Uh, but John Walls was immensely talented. We are lucky enough to have quite a few of his headstones scattered around Bonaventure Cemetery, and his artwork has such a softness to them. Uh, they look so realistic and so soft that you look like you could just go up and they would be soft to the touch, but they're not. They're made out of marble. uh, so he did this headstone for little Gracie, and eventually after about 15 years, her parents started to move up north because they managed hotels for a living. And so they went where the work was. They ended up in New York. And when they passed away, they were buried there. They were buried in Menands, far away from their little girl. And a lot of people think it's really sad that she's buried there by herself. Excuse me. And so a lot of people are drawn to that. They're drawn to this little girl. She is considered an orphan grave because her headstone and her grave plot are maintained by the Bonaventure Historical Society. She doesn't have any direct family in the area taking care of her. Because she's so popular, the Historical Society had to put up a fence around her grave because so many people kept messing with her headstone. And marble in itself is also a very soft stone, and it will deteriorate over time. So on top of raising money to restore the gates, we are also raising money to restore her headstone because there's been some damage over the years from visitors and also just weathering in general. But we have also done work to preserve other graves. There are some tabletop graves that we just recently restored. We built new legs for them and made sure that the actual tops were solid enough to still stand. We designed and restored a new boundary for another historic grave for a former mayor of Savannah. So a lot of people think it's weird. There's a historic society for a cemetery. But that's what we do. We make sure that these headstones to these people that they built either for themselves or had loved ones built for them to remind people of who they were still continue to stand.
Okay, now you had another story about a gentleman who wrote some famous songs too.
Yes. So a lot of famous Savannahans are buried out at Bonaventure Cemetery, and some are locally known. And then others are a little bit more nationally and internationally known. One of those is a man named Johnny Mercer. His nickname is Savannah's favorite son. He grew up here in Savannah. Eventually, he got into songwriting and moved to New York. When he got the opportunity, he also moved out to LA to start writing songs for movies. He was nominated, I want to say, for 14 Oscars. I believe that's correct. And won 4 of them. Wrote a lot of different songs that a lot of people would recognize, including Jeepers Creepers, which trends on TikTok every once in a while. Also, the song Moon River that was written for Breakfast at Tiffany's. He wrote the lyrics for that. He also, interestingly enough, wrote the lyrics for the Addams Family theme song.
Isn't that wild?
But he's not credited for it, and that is on purpose. So one of his friends actually wrote the music for it and was having trouble with the lyrics. So he went to Johnny and said, "Hey, it's this quirky little TV show. It's based off a newspaper comic strip. I cannot come up with the lyrics to this. Can you have a go at it?" And according to the family, Johnny thought it was ridiculous, but he wrote the lyrics for it and said, "I don't want credit for it." So yeah, every time you watch reruns of The Addams Family, you're listening to a Johnny Mercer song.
That's funny. But yeah, it's just interesting, the stories that emerge from the cemeteries. Yeah, I really, one of my favorite cemeteries was in Paris, and when I got to see the grave of Jim Morrison, which seems kind of weird, but you know, it's like it's this journey that you're on, and it's kind of the cemetery, the large cemeteries, it's like this adventure to be weaving through, and it's usually very quiet and very reverent is what I like about it. But his grave was not very reverent. There were all kinds of interesting things that were left there for him, you know, to enjoy, I suppose. So well, thank you. Walk me through like a day in the office. What's it like to go work in the Bonaventure Historical Society?
So currently we are only there on the weekends.
Perfect.
We man we man the visitor center, which is also the office for the city cemeteries department.
Mhm.
Uh, and we pass out maps. We have some that are available for donation that have like a little bit more information about the cemetery. But we pass out free maps and talk to people about different headstones that they'd like to see. Some people come there specifically to see a certain grave.
Mhm.
And we also guide people to their families because even though the city cemeteries department is not there on the weekends, we still get a lot of people who come visit and they want to go visit a relative's grave. Maybe they were doing some ancestry work and suddenly realized, oh, we have family in Savannah and they're buried over here in Bonaventure.
Mhm.
And so we have to show them how to use the kiosk, which thankfully is working,
Mhm.
where they can just look them up and get step-by-step directions to their loved ones' graves.
That's great.
Mhm.
Do you guys host any events out there or anything
Yes.
like, yep.
Every second Saturday and Sunday of the month, we offer free tours.
Mhm.
Currently, those are just at 2 p.m., though we are hoping to expand that.
Mhm.
But anybody is welcome to come to those. You can also visit Bonaventure Cemetery anytime you want during the week. It is open 7 days a week
Mhm.
from 8 in the morning to 5 in the evening. Uh, but coming up this weekend, I'm not sure when you're airing this, but this is something that happens every year as well. Every year we have the fall tours, and
Mm.
that's something a little different.
Mhm.
During our free tours, it's a tour guide with the Bonaventure Historical Society who takes you around and talks about the history and some of the personal stories there. But the fall tours, we have people who dress up as some of the historic people who are residents at Bonaventure. Uh, and so as you're walking around, yes, you have a tour guide who does tell you a bit about the history, but at certain burial plots, you will also get to meet some of these people. And if you ever want to talk to Mary Telfair, the heiress, you could have a quick little conversation with her or Johnny Mercer.
That's such a fun event, like such an interesting way to get people involved and just experience the cemetery. That's really cool.
Mhm.
How long have you guys been doing that?
The the fall tours or the
Yeah, those,
society?
yeah, no, the fall tours.
I actually don't know how long they've been
Okay,
doing that.
no big deal.
Um, the society itself has been around since the 90s.
Okay. So I know that you could spend days in the cemetery walking around. However, if you were only in Savannah for a day, how could you enjoy this? Like what coffee shop is nearby, what place to eat, what am I going to do in Savannah for the day when I'm
Got
just
you.
there?
So Bonaventure is actually outside of historic downtown. Most people come to visit Savannah and they just spend their entire time in historic downtown, which is
Mhm.
fine. There's a lot of stuff to see there. I've
Mhm.
been here for more than 10 years and I haven't seen it all.
Mhm.
But if you drive about 10, 15 minutes outside of historic downtown, you will find Bonaventure. And the closest sandwich shop slash coffee shop is Finch's Sandwiches and Sundries.
Okay.
And it is the cutest little place. It's a converted old gas station, like 1940s gas station. Uh, and they have delicious sandwiches. You should try the tater tots that are dusted with Old Bay. Oh my
Oh,
God, those are
okay.
so good.
I'm now
Uh,
hungry. That sounds great.
but after you've gone to Finch's, then you go back to Bonaventure.
Mhm.
Uh, the top five graves I would say to see out at Bonaventure are, of course, Little Gracie,
Mhm.
Johnny Mercer,
Mhm.
Conrad Aiken, who was a U.S. poet laureate, and Charles F. Mills. He has the only intact safety bell left in Bonaventure.
Oh.
Yeah. And Mary Telfair, who was an heiress and a benefactor.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so tell us about the bell, because that's a story.
Yes. Oh my God, that is a journey. So there was this panic after a while that everybody was worried about being buried alive.
Mm-hmm.
How real this fear was and how often it happened is kind of debated by historians, but it was this general panic that, if you died, the doctors wouldn't be able to detect your pulse and they might bury you alive. There were all sorts of famous stories, several written by Edgar Allan Poe, that tie into this fear. So being a capitalistic society, you've got some people who are like, okay, I can take advantage of this. I can create safety graves. And there are all sorts of different designs. The most common one involved bells,
Mm-hmm.
which, if you saw the movie The Nun, there's that scene where they're in the graveyard and all the bells start to ring. That's a safety bell.
That's a safety bell, guys.
That's a safety bell. So these bells would often be attached to a string or a rope that would lead down into the person's coffin and would be attached to their wrist or their ankle. So if they did happen to be buried alive and they woke up, they could ring that bell and the caretaker or anybody who happened to be close by could come forward and help them.
So is the one there still have its string attached?
As far as we know, it does.
Uh-huh.
His is set up kind of interesting. His is the only one that's still out there because his is made of brass. And many of the other bells were recycled during the war effort to make munitions. His wasn't because it was the wrong material. So that's why his is the only one still out there.
Okay.
But the way that his was attached, the entire mechanism is enclosed. So the only way to ring the bell is literally from inside the coffin.
Oh, wow.
The bell, instead of having just a regular stem, there's a tube there that the Historical Society believes also would have acted as an air vent, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
And the rope or string would have been inside that tube.
Mm-hmm.
Now, his mausoleum is completely closed. We don't have access to that. So we are assuming it's still attached. It may have, frayed away over time, but the bell itself is still the only intact bell in Bonaventure.
Mm-hmm. How wild. So the like reinterred, right? That whole story I'm thinking about. I have a funny contribution to share. So
Okay.
my grandmother was cremated, and we as a family went out to the family property and spread some of her ashes and had some of her ashes in a box that we buried in a place on the family cemetery on our land in Texas, which you can do. And anyways, years later, there was a family member who decided that she did not want the box of my grandmother there, and she decided to go out and get it and sprinkle the ashes on her parents, my Mimi's parents' graves in Austin. And so that was fine. But however, I didn't know it. And so for years, I was sitting down there thinking I was like at peace with my Mimi. It's like she's not there the whole time. And then I
Aw.
was telling the story about like then they dug her up and they took her back to Austin. And my cousin said, Tiffany, did you like make sure that they knew that she was actually cremated? Because when you say dug her up, it sounds really bad, you know. But this idea that people do move after like move grave sites, it's I'm glad that you brought that up, and it's not just a weird Tiffany family story. It is part of history, and people do change their minds, and that might be part of your family story. But yeah, Enocha, I really appreciate your time and sharing a little bit about your area, your cemetery. I know that I'm going to have some listeners asking, why didn't you ask about ghost stories? And I just want to be very respectful and sharing that you guys have an agreement to not. And so are you able to share a little bit about that?
Sure.
Yep.
Since Bonaventure, it is weirdly enough a tourist destination, and I know some people have some very complicated feelings about that. but it's also an active cemetery. People are still being buried out there.
Mhm.
And the city, as well as the Historical Society, feels that in order to share space with these families who are still grieving, we don't tell ghost stories out
Yeah.
there. We get people who come up to the visitor center all the time asking us about ghost stories, and we're like, we're not the people to ask. We're the Historic Society. So sorry. If you want a ghost story, go on a ghost tour downtown.
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's important to remember that as beautiful as this place is, and as much as, yes, we do want people to visit and learn about the history, you do also have to remember that you're sharing space with newer graves of people who died recently, and their families and their friends and other loved ones may be coming out there to visit and to grieve.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Well, I know I'm disappointed we don't get ghost stories, but I'm also I think it's really appropriate, and I think it's a good thing to bring to the conversation, just to be mindful of the spaces that we're in. So okay, any last tidbits, anything that you wish we had got in there, anything coming to mind for you?
So I can't share any ghost stories, but
Mhm.
there are a few ghost adjacent, I guess you could say, stories, legends, and some that sound like it's a legend, but is true.
Okay.
Uh, there is a plot out there, a mausoleum called the Monjan Mausoleum.
Okay.
And it was moved there somewhere around the year 1900 from Defusky Island. Now, there's a lot of different legends about why it's there on that particular plot. A lot of people said, the whole thing was just too heavy. They couldn't get any farther into Bonaventure Cemetery, which is on a river, so they left it right there close to the river. The truth is, John Mongan actually paid for that plot, so he probably did intend to be buried there.
Mhm.
Uh, but in 1989, someone or several someones broke into the mausoleum and stole pretty much everything and everyone out of it.
Whoa, that's spooky.
Yeah. So it's almost completely empty. I believe there are coffins still left in there, and there may be a few remains, but for the
Oh,
most part, it's empty.
and they didn't ever
Uh,
catch who did that?
no, it's unsolved.
Wow, that's creepy.
Yeah. Uh, Now, I mentioned Little Gracie earlier, and there are a few different legends about her statue because, again, she's a very iconic grave out there. So, people are going to make up all sorts of legends. One is that her statue comes alive at night and runs around the cemetery, which I think is hilarious. I
I
have
read
yet to
that
see that
one.
happen.
Right.
Uh, there's another legend that if you steal any of the gifts that have been left in front of her, that her statue cries tears of blood.
Oh,
Uh,
pause.
okay.
I'm sorry about that interruption. She cries tears of what did you say?
The legend is that if you steal any of the gifts left in front of her, that her statue cries tears of blood,
Ooh,
which is
okay.
a
All
little
right.
intense.
So don't
Uh,
try that one out.
right. So there's another volunteer with the Historic Society who has his own tour company. His name is Bonaventure Don,
Hmm.
and he will go out there to clean off her grave. And we were talking about this one day, and he said, "Look, if anybody's going to see her cry tears of blood, it's going to be me, and I've never seen that." Uh, it is still rude to try and steal anything off her grave, I think. Uh, so maybe that was just more of a warning, like, hey, just don't be a jerk.
Right.
But another volunteer with the Historic Society, her brother had a very interesting story from when he was a kid.
Okay.
Uh, so he went to school close by, and every once in a while, he and some of his friends would skip school and go to Bonaventure Cemetery
Okay, let me
because
fix that. Okay. Tell me, I'm sorry for the interruption. Tell me
it's
again.
okay. I totally get it.
It was gonna be one of
Uh,
us with the cats and the dogs. They were bound to go off at some
oh
point.
yeah, oh yeah. Uh, so one of the Bonaventure Historical Society volunteers, her brother had an interesting interaction when he was a little kid. He
Mhm.
went to school nearby, and every once in a while he would skip school and head to the cemetery because it's on the Wilmington River.
Mhm.
He and his friends would go out there to go fishing, and they would always leave their lunch money in front of little Gracie's statue. Now, he said that the one time he didn't leave his lunch money there, that was the time they were caught by the truant officer.
Oh, really? So you better leave your lunch money, kids.
Right.
Don't want to get caught. Yeah. Well, I mean, those are innocent enough, right? Those are innocent enough legends, and I know that there's many pictures of her too. If you guys want to look up some of this stuff online too,
Mhm.
I really just appreciate your time and sharing, your wisdom, your history, your experience, and in your area of the world. And I know, I mean, it's just such a beautiful place that is just so rich with soul. And so I'm glad for the opportunity to shine it out there. And I know that you're working on a couple of projects with the gate and something else you mentioned. Is there a way that people can donate?
Yes, if you go to our website, and I hope I'm remembering it correctly, I think it's just bonaventurehistorical.org. And it might
Okay.
also be bonaventurehistoricalsociety.org.
Yeah. Okay.
It is one of those.
Let me see if I can find it. Okay, and so we just go there and donate.
You can go there and donate. You can also become a member of the
Oh,
Historical
great.
Society. You don't have to live in Savannah. You can sign up to become a member. You get newsletters every once in a while. We have
Mhm.
special talks. We're also working on making that accessible to people who live outside of Savannah. So there's all sorts of little perks to becoming a member, even if you don't live in Savannah.
Okay, so it's bonaventurehistorical.org. I keep saying it wrong, but I'll put the link in the show notes so that you guys can find it and learn more about this and maybe plan a trip there. And well, I think that's it for now. So happy Halloween, everybody. Enjoy your October, be inspired, go visit a cemetery, learn some legends, learn some history. And thanks again, Enocha. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Okay.